I'll tell you a bit about my background. I did my PhD in visual arts, in cultural studies actually, but my area of research is in visual arts, focusing on contemporary art in Asia and also contemporary Asian art in Australia. And I also have some experience working within arts and cultural institutions. So I was on the board of I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Foray Centre for Contemporary Asian Art, which is quite a major, it's now got major arts organisation status according to the Australian Council. It's a major art gallery in Chinatown, and it's got a very interesting, diverse program that profiles the work of contemporary Asian art in Australia and from Asia. So I used to be on the board of that, and these days I also do policy evaluation for various organisations. So the last evaluation report I did was for Campbelltown Arts Centre. They had a 3-year major exhibition of the works of Asian Pacific artists, which involved these artists working in communities, and I was commissioned to write a report that evaluated the impact of these art projects on the communities. And there's a whole body of literature on evaluation, which I think is quite interesting, fascinating. And indeed, evaluation is now a key requirement of funding bodies, as many of you may know. So anyway, I wrote that report for Campbelltown Arts Centre, and that was part of their acquittal of an Australian Council grant that supported that exhibition over 3 years. I'm also currently writing an evaluation report for a small arts organisation called Information Cultural Exchange in Parramatta. Maybe you've heard of it, ICE, evaluating their creative arts program and looking at the ways in which that may or may not have benefited the various creative practitioners who have enrolled in that program. That program is meant to provide support to these various creative practitioners in order to place them in a good, solid entrepreneurial footing, i.e. enable them to develop their enterprise. And the extent to which they were successful is something or not, something that I'm currently in the process of evaluating. In fact, the report is due in about a week's time.
Just before the AGM?
Sorry? Yeah. Do you know ICE?
Yeah, I'm actually a member, but I can't make the AGM.
Okay. This is one of the quirks of teaching arts and cultural policy. No, these people. There's only like a few degrees of separation. Okay, so that's my background, and I also do have a research interest in arts and cultural policy insofar as I'm doing a bit of research on cultural policy in Hong Kong and in Singapore. The Hong Kong line is in relation to arts policy and the role of the art market over there. And in Singapore, it's more broadly the cultural and creative industries policy that they have in place. I also teach in design, and so in April I'll be taking my design students there to immerse them in the design environment and also to get a sense of how that particular city-state have realised a very substantive and very detailed cultural and creative policy that also that focuses across a range of art and cultural forms, design, architecture, heritage, and so on. Okay. Anyway, so that's my background. What I want to talk to you today, and the way I'm going to run, this class and the classes in week 6 and 11 is not so much give you a proper lecture as such, but just take you through a number of talking points and key ideas that I've pulled out. Give you some resources and also get you to do and engage in activities. It's great that we've actually got 6, so I can actually divide you up into 2 groups and you can kind of like, because I was a bit worried over 5, it's just 2 and 3. Now that we've got 6, that's like an even division. Get you to, work out, and unpack, various cultural policy frameworks and rationales. So, and we're going to have a break. What's a good time to have a break? When did you have your break last week?
I didn't.
Oh, you didn't? You made us.
Forced them.
Right.
All 3 hours and I'm starving and thirsty by the end of it.
Okay.
So I've got through this week and there's a kitchen around the corner if people want to get a drink and there's toilets around here.
Okay. Okay. Maybe for this class.
You can have a break on the hour or maybe 7:30
Yeah.
halfway through. Yeah.
I've got a couple of activities, and maybe we break just before you get started on those activities. Okay, I want to talk about cultural policy, and I had a look at your lecture slides, and what I want to do, I just want to flesh it out a little bit more, provide some very, very rudimentary historical as well as theoretical perspectives on cultural policy, and also talk about some of the aims and origins of arts and cultural policy and what it does. So, can you all read that?
It's a bit tricky.
Yeah, I'll read that. Turn the screen, yeah.
Okay. Everyone can see it? Yeah? Okay, cool. I just want to provide you with 2 main contexts for thinking about, and these are like historical contexts for thinking about cultural policy. The first one has to do with the relationship between culture and the state. And I guess one key historical moment to be aware of is the French Revolution. As many of you know, the French Revolution occurred in 1789, and this led to the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the French Republic. For our purposes, when we are thinking about cultural policy, it's quite important to think about how the state has come to see itself as playing a key role in the support and dissemination and custodianship of culture. Okay, and one of the main points to note here is that in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the French state played a key role in as a custodian of national culture and national patrimony, cultural patrimony. Patrimony simply refers to heritage or legacy. Okay, and it did so through various museums, but also through protection of seemingly intangible cultural objects like language. So the French state, even to this day, plays a very crucial role in protecting the French language. And during negotiations that it undertakes, trade negotiations where culture is at stake, is being debated and discussed, it always ensures that French as a language is protected from the encroachment of what it sees as an Anglo-dominated, cultural flow into the country. Okay, so you can think of, say, the import of, say, Hollywood movies, the import and distribution and screening of Hollywood movies in France. There are certain regulations that ensure that this doesn't encroach adversely on the French film industry and by extension French culture and French language. Language policy is a huge thing in French cultural policy. And up until recently, the let's call it the ENA, which is the École Nationale d'Administration, which is the main school that educates civil servants in France. Up until very recently, French as a language has been enshrined within the curriculum, and it's only been recently that English is being taught to these civil servants. There's only this gradual recognition that English is really, it has been for a very long time, a global lingua franca, not just of diplomacy but also business and culture, but increasingly so politics as well. And there's now a recognition that civil servants would need to acquire English as a second language in France. But for a very long time, up until say a year ago, English was not a requirement, which is quite amazing. I think, given that France, like any other country around the world, is also subject to the forces of globalization. In other words, there are various cultural and media flows coming into the country, and politicians, cultural policymakers and planners have to address those issues. So language is one of the areas that the state, in particular the French state, have appropriated and has seen itself as playing a crucial role in administering. Likewise, education, the collective rituals as well of the state and of the nation. All of this play a role in ensuring that individual citizens become integrated into the common or national culture. Okay, so one of the main early rationales for cultural policy, even though the term cultural policy wasn't used back then, but one of the early rationales for state intervention into the realm of culture was to ensure that the citizens would become integrated into the common culture, the national culture. Okay, and the obvious ways to do that was through language, through education, through collective rituals. Australia's got its own collective rituals, on Anzac Day, for instance. Through the mass media. Okay, all of these play a role in integrating citizens into the national culture. So that's one historical context or moment to keep in mind. And already there you have a particular context where the state intervenes quite significantly into this realm of culture. And the extent to which that occurs in other contexts, in different contexts, in the Australian context, the American context, the European context, or the Chinese context, it varies according to very specific social, political, economic histories that each of these countries have. Okay. But I just wanted to give you just a very broad sense of that relationship between the state and culture. The second thing to note, and this came out of post-war decolonization, so in the aftermath of the Second World War, many countries acquired political independence. They became independent from the former as well colonial rulers, and their cultural policies were quite crucial in ensuring that political independence also became tied up with the idea of cultural sovereignty. Okay, so rather than simply hanging on to the yoke of once former colonial ruler, many of these countries around the world that acquired political independence in the aftermath of the Second World War, through a process of decolonisation, sought to develop policies to ensure that they were sovereign cultural entities or nations, that they had exercised, they were able to exercise cultural sovereignty alongside political independence. Okay, and the international governing bodies, the UN, through its cultural arm or wing, UNESCO played a key role in ensuring that policies of cultural diversity, work to maintain and consolidate that sense of cultural sovereignty amongst these newly emergent independent states. Okay. So there you have, just a very broad sense of how, you may think about cultural policy. One, in terms of state-citizen relations, and two, in terms of how emerging states have sought to acquire a sense of cultural sovereignty along with political independence. These are the two historical moments that sort of keeping in mind. Theoretical perspectives. A really common theoretical framework that has been deployed in Australia, but also elsewhere, is this idea of governmentality. Has anyone come across this term? Governmentality. Governmentality is a term that has been deployed by Michel Foucault. Has anyone heard of Michel Foucault? Yes, no? Okay, one person. Michel Foucault is a French social theorist who has written quite a fair bit on the role of the state and how, in particular, the liberal state manages to govern. Okay. And for Foucault, governmentality occurs not so much through the use of brute force, but through indirect means, often through acts of persuasion, through technologies of learning, instruments, educational instruments or institutions. Okay, that's how a state manages to shape the conduct of its citizens. Okay. So what we're talking about here is not so much, the state forcing, a set of cultural values or ideals, down the throat of, members of its population or the nation, through the use of brute force. But rather, we have a situation whereby the state governs from a distance, i.e. indirectly, through arts and cultural institutions, through educational institutions, by putting in place arts and cultural policies that would support these institutions, in order for these institutions to then shape the conduct of citizens. So to give you an example, someone like Tony Bennett, who I've referred to here, has written a lot about arts and cultural policy, but also in his earlier work he's talked about museums, the development, the rise and the development of museums in Europe, where he traces these governmental relations that were put in place in order to position museums as sites where the conduct of citizens are shaped and managed. Okay. And if you think about it, a museum and think of how people act as they walk into a museum, how children act as they walk into a museum. Often there's this unspoken rule that you do so quietly. Yeah? Now this sense of walking into, or this experience of walking into a museum and doing so quietly, interacting with whatever work that's on display, with a certain distance, if you like, and in fact treating these works as having this kind of sacred aura, is a form of behaviour. Okay, and when museums emerged, one of the underlying rationales for the state to support the development of museums is to ensure that the conduct and behaviour of citizens who walked into these major institutions, cultural institutions, would be shaped accordingly. Okay, that they would develop certain cultural habits, certain ways of acting and conducting themselves within the sphere of civic and cultural life. Okay, it's a very, very fascinating history. Yes.
It's so different from libraries because, surely one has affected the other to turn it down.
Mhm.
Look at libraries as well, or are you just talking about museums because that's what you studied?
I'm focusing on museums, but libraries too.
Because that's surely doing the same thing, and I think
Mm.
being quiet would definitely come from. Because you're exposed to a library first in the order of education anyway. When you were youngest, you go to a library before you go to a museum, and you just apply the same rules. Anyway.
Both libraries and museums have relatively parallel as well as entangled histories, and they do play quite similar roles and functions in terms of shaping certain conduct and ways of thinking. The library has certain affinities with the encyclopedia, and its ability to order things and classify things accordingly. And likewise, the museums too have that sense of classification. They would classify certain objects or artifacts as symbols of civilization, others of primitivism, and so forth. And those are very real hierarchies. And so these various institutions, the library, the museum, they are quite entangled in their histories, and they do have parallel lives and affinities as well.
I think the ways of thinking around libraries and museums is that these are institutions that house artifacts that require reverence.
Yeah.
And so that is why we go into a museum and we don't touch anything, we're quiet, it's supposed to be a reflective space, just like a library, and that's the kind of institutional ways again of governing behaviour, or what I would call kind of user experience of an institution.
There's been a number of really interesting arguments that's been made about how the role and the place of museums in the modern world, and how it plays a crucial role, particularly in a modern secular world. And some people have argued that museums have replaced religious institutions, precisely because you walk into these institutions and the objects and artifacts before you are ones that you look upon in a very enthralled way, with a sort of awe and a sense of wonder, which is akin to a religious experience, one could argue. And in the sense that you're meant to maintain a distance, and you're literally physically cordoned off from that artwork, painting, or object. And the architecture of museums themselves are often quite grand and monumental. If you look at the Art Gallery in New South Wales and its faux classical columns, it's meant to speak of a certain grandeur, okay, much like the institution of the church, okay. So there's this argument that's been made by a theorist such as French social theorist such as Pierre Bourdieu, that art and cultural institutions play a key role, or can be seen as symptomatic of an increasingly secularized world, and they have, in many ways, replaced religion as a source of value or aura, if you like. Okay, this is this is where we find things that are now sacred in a sense.
And then how much of that do you think? I think it's Bourdieu that again talks about class and
Yes.
and its relevance to how we have cultural citizens.
Mhm.
So how much do you think that reverence, immediately as we walk through the door of a museum or a library, how much do you think that is actually an artifact of, a highly hierarchical class
I
structure?
think it's a lot. If you look at school kids, kids who go on a school excursion to the Art Gallery in New South Wales, a keen and acute observer would note the class backgrounds of these school kids. And those kids who were brought up in families who would go to museums and galleries quite regularly would be the ones who would be very much aware of the protocols of behavior and conduct that should occur in a museum setting. Whereas those who come from families that do not have that sort of, who do not frequently go to these places, won't be aware of that. And they'd be just running amok and, better or worse, but it's a very interesting thing to observe in terms of, the social class and how those habits, are formed. And also how cultural literacies are formed as well. Some kids, would appreciate readily and perhaps quite easily the significance of more abstract works, whereas others would, rely on more narrative-based paintings, for instance, in order to, grasp the significance and value of the work. There's definitely an element of class in place. Indeed, one of the main tensions that arts and cultural policy makers have to grapple with is that tension between the elite arts and popular culture. How do you juggle the various competing interests and imperatives that is at work and in play? That's one amongst many other tensions. You have the regional, metropolitan, etc.
But you also talks about cultural capital.
Yes.
And so there is that unspoken assumption that an artifact in a museum or a library or whatever has cultural meaning simply by being part of the collection.
That's right.
So and that is why it needs to be revered, it's meaningful, that's why we should take an interest. And cultural policy also does that. It teaches us what is culturally important simply by what it focuses on.
Yes.
And what collections should be preserved. As some of the Creative Australia policy points to. We need to preserve these particular collections. We need to put more funding into.
Yes.
I mean, some of the more recent debates about, say, shifting the Powerhouse Museum to Parramatta all hinges on a set of assumptions about levels of cultural capital and access to culture. And some have argued that it's actually quite patronising for the current state government to to assume that the Powerhouse Museum should be relegated to Parramatta because there's no culture in Western Sydney, which is not true. There's a lot of cultural producers over there, and so that's that's a very problematic assumption. Whereas others argue that actually, well, maybe it's a good thing to relocate the Powerhouse Museum.
I thought the reason behind the relocation is because Parramatta is quite vibrant and the Powerhouse has more chance of survival out there.
Well, that's
Yeah.
the one of the main arguments that people like Joanna Mendelssohn has put forward. There are major problems, in fact, with the current building, the Powerhouse Museum, and it's awkward placement. It's awkward location. It's not really attracting as much audiences as it should, and that it would be better placed in Parramatta, which requires a kind of investment in cultural infrastructure. One of the things that hasn't really been touched upon is that the Powerhouse Museum really also needs to reflect on its collections and public programs policy, I think, and make it a lot more diverse. And this is not just for the Powerhouse; this is also for the MCA, New South Wales, etc. If a state government, and any government really, but any Labor or coalition state government want to make culture much more accessible and provide support for it, then it should look at existing public programs and the collections policy, to the extent to which they actually reflect the diversity of the population in the state. So yeah, I mean the debate is complex. And I'm sure
with
Sydney has
cultural policy, that no expert, that doesn't tend to go down to the level of what an institution should be programming, though, does it? It's fairly more kind of high level visionary.
Yes, that's true. There are frameworks, but there are frameworks that are underpinned by sort of values, and within those frameworks, they have programs and initiatives that then impact upon what eventually happens at ground level. Now some of those, some of the instruments of cultural policy may, directly support
What the institutions
that an institution could be set up, or indeed scholarships, fellowships can be put in place, just like the creative nation policy of the Keating government had a set of fellowships were attached to it, and that directly supported artists, writers, performers, etc. And likewise, if a national cultural policy has a places as its or identifies as its priority an engagement with say the region, Asia Pacific region, as did both the Creative Nation and Creative Australia policy, then that has an impact upon the kinds of funding that Asia Link, for instance, would receive, and that then has an impact on the number of artists who can get residencies in Asia. So it does have kind of a flow-on effect, and I think the thing about analysing cultural policy is you need to try and identify, tease out, and critically interrogate its underlying values and rationale. That's where you that's where the fundamental debates around cultural policy lie. I mean, there's all kinds of initiatives that flow from that. The details of the policy and the details of its implementation at state and perhaps even at local government level. But a national cultural policy does have an underlying rationale, a set of values that underpin it, and it's that needs to be kind of unpacked and developed. So just to wrap up just the points here, the point to note is this is just a broad theoretical frame. If you're looking for a theory that would help you think about the development and implementation of policy and how that has a bearing upon the relationship between the state and the citizen, then Foucault's notion of governmentality is I think quite useful and quite fertile in helping you think through those ideas. And indeed, it's an approach that it's called Griffith School of Cultural Policy Studies, Griffith University up in Queensland. They had set up a centre it's called a Key Centre for Cultural Policy, and that centre was set up in the 1990s. And Keating put in place, created a nation, and much of the methodology that the researchers in that centre deployed was centered around this notion of governmentality. This is how the state would, formulate and develop and indeed implement policy. Through a kind of an arm's length or indirect governance of the population. Okay, that's the underlying theoretical assumption. Does everyone grasp that?
Would you say the French model is less indirect? Is that more direct intervention?
The French is a little bit more direct, and much more interventionist, particularly in the areas of language, film. It really does carve out, exceptions. When the French state negotiates the GATT, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, forums. It makes an exception for itself, a cultural exception for itself. Okay, this is not subject. French culture is not subject to free trade. That's what it's saying. And it's that kind of cultural exceptionalism that has been in place for a very long time in France, and it's the underlying rationale of that, of course, is that French culture and French language, which embodies the culture. Ought to be protected from the encroachment of a predominantly Anglo-centric global culture, where Hollywood movies and films tend to prevail and tend to encroach upon the culture in France. Okay. In fact, the French Royal Academy, each year they put out a kind of a directive to civil servants that tells them not to, use anglicized words, in everyday communication, speech as well. Okay, and there are very specific French words being used. Like the weekend. Don't use that. I found that's a very popular word in France. Le weekend. And that's seen as an encroachment. The use of that word is seen as an encroachment upon French culture. Okay, so language is here a crucial consideration or concern for the French state. Yeah.
I know some people who have recently gone to France and they were, because they didn't know French,
Yeah.
a lot of French were very rude to them,
Mhm.
and that's so funny because that's effective behaviour to the point where they are horrible in return. It's funny.
Yeah, it is changing.
What did they do with the internet then? Like, how do you censor that? Surely.
Oh no, I mean, a lot of French people actually do speak English. It's just that they often refuse to do so. They prefer to communicate in French. And
It's a great example of how policy is practiced.
Mm.
Then you go to France and they will refuse to speak to you in
Yeah, they
English,
do. They're not
If-
saying
if-
they want you to.
even if they know that you don't know. Well, they find it disrespectful that
Yeah.
you don't know any French.
Yes, I was going to say.
And that you're visiting France and you haven't made no effort
Yeah.
to learn a language, which is probably quite legitimate, but then will make no effort to try and communicate with you. Yeah.
okay, let me just move on very quickly, just to. Okay, this is just some brief talking points about the some of the origins and aims of cultural policy, and just noted down three things. One, social improvement. How do you improve the habits, the conduct, the sensibilities of a population through arts and cultural policy? Okay.
Yes, and who's judging that improvement?
Well, that's another key consideration, and what is the criteria for that? The other thing to note is state subsidy or government support for art and culture often arises precisely because the market is seen as not being able to provide that kind of support. Okay, or at least that's one of the justifications that are being deployed. That state subvention or subsidy or support is required precisely because the market cannot take on that role or responsibility in supporting culture. Now, this is again, of course, a point of contention because quite a few people argue that actually the market should play a greater role in providing investments in infrastructure in the realm of culture. Private philanthropy, etc. And this is something that we can discuss and debate. The third point to note is again national culture. The role that cultural policy has in shaping the way in which we identify ourselves as a nation, and shaping who we are as a nation, our cultural identity. So these are kind of like the three main aims, if you like, of cultural policy. It's geared towards social improvement. It's geared towards providing support where the market is unable to. And it's geared towards, providing citizens with a sense of who they are as a nation. Now, often arts and cultural policy are lumped together as kind of like this phrase, arts and cultural policy. And I guess one, and different governments have got different terminologies that they use. But I guess one way to think about the difference between arts and cultural policy is in terms of the domain of application. Okay, so when you think about the arts, you can think of it in terms of, basically the producers and consumers of, a relatively limited, domain of practice. Okay, whereas culture is more broad, one that would encompass the entertainment, the gaming industries, questions of copyright, media, etc. Okay. whereas arts policy tends to be very narrowly focused. Having said that, one of the key themes that the Creative Australia policy, emphasised, as well as the Creative Nation policy too, was already, back in the 90s, there was already a sense of the convergence of different media. Okay, how artists would, aren't simply, working in studios, but they're also interacting and interfacing with other media, and therefore, an arts policy or an arts policy framework tends to be too narrow to capture and to accommodate for the interests and concerns of artists or creative producers who are working across different media. Okay, and likewise, you can think of the ways in which the development of, say, the games industry. I'm talking about video games. This is often located within a broad creative industries policy, and yet artists themselves, contemporary artists, often produce work that involve elements of gaming, and they do work with game designers as well. So those kinds of collaborative partnerships between different kinds of cultural producers is now increasingly recognised, and that's one of the reasons why there has been a broadening of the scope beyond arts policy to encompass cultural and creative industries as a policy, precisely because artists these days are not simply working in studios, in traditional studios. They are actually producing work across media. Okay, and there's been a convergence of different technologies, different media over the past 2 decades in particular. As I've already mentioned, arts and cultural policy do play a key role in shaping questions of citizenship and an identity, national identity. And the role of the citizen and how he or she may actively participate in the making of culture. The making and the consumption of culture is, is a focal concern of cultural policy. How do you ensure access and participation, for all citizens in the national culture? That is one of the main concerns, even to this day. That has always been a key concern. Now, how that balances itself out when you weigh it up against, say, economic considerations or economic concerns, that's where the debates around cultural policy lie. Just moving on. There are various instruments of cultural policy. You can think of it in terms of direct support, i.e. grants, funding to major or not small arts and cultural institutions, providing grants directly to artists, or establishing fellowships. That's one instrument of support that a cultural policy can deploy, just through direct funding. Cultural policy also tends to regulate, and this is the case with media policy, through copyright regimes. It also tends to influence the market for cultural products. Okay. through like tax incentives, for instance. Those are some of the the instruments that that are in place.